She woke up before the sun, the sky still dark and quiet, carrying the weight of the journey ahead. The small apartment felt colder than usual, even with the thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She double-checked the bag at her feet, feeling the familiar texture of each item she had packed. Everything had to be in order. Every piece of paper, every small tool, every personal item had its place. One mistake could change everything. The streets outside were empty except for the occasional early riser walking briskly to wherever they needed to go. The air was sharp, filled with the smell of dust and exhaust from the few passing vehicles. She moved quickly, careful not to draw attention. Her steps echoed softly on the pavement, but her mind was loud with anticipation. She had done this many times before, but this time felt different. This time carried more weight. She had always been someone who planned carefully. Even as a child, she remembered organizing her school bag the night before, making sure every notebook was straight and every pencil sharp. That habit had stayed with her. Now, with much more at stake, it mattered more than ever. She took a deep breath and adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder. It was heavy, not just because of what it carried, but because of the responsibility attached to it. As she approached the checkpoint, the first thing she noticed was the tension in the air. It wasn't just the uniforms or the barricades. It was the way people moved, the way their eyes darted quickly, watching everything and everyone. She could feel her pulse quicken slightly, though she told herself to stay calm. The checkpoint wasn't a place for panic. It was a place for focus, for careful observation. One wrong move, one nervous gesture, and her journey could end before it even began. The checkpoint was larger than she remembered from the last time she passed through. Tall barriers cut across the road, and guards in sharp uniforms stood at intervals, their eyes scanning every approaching vehicle and every person walking by. Radios crackled faintly, and she could hear a few commands exchanged in short, clipped phrases. There was an unspoken rhythm to it, a routine that everyone followed. Yet it seemed as though anything could break that rhythm at any moment. She kept walking, trying to appear casual, even though her heart beat a little faster with each step. People around her glanced at her briefly but quickly looked away. Some were clearly used to the procedures, moving with quiet patience, while others seemed nervous, shifting from foot to foot, murmuring softly to themselves or companions. She understood both feelings, yet she could not afford either. Patience, calm, focus, those were her only tools. When she reached the first barrier, a guard stepped forward holding a clipboard. He didn't smile, didn't greet her, just looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between neutral and suspicious. She offered a polite nod, which seemed to satisfy him, and handed over her papers without hesitation. He examined them slowly, flipping through each page with meticulous care. She kept her eyes level, her expression neutral, careful not to give anything away. The guard's fingers paused on certain pages. She noticed the slight frown that creased his forehead and held her breath, but he didn't say anything. He placed the papers back on the clipboard and gave a curt nod. "Next," he said, directing her toward the main checkpoint area. She stepped forward, her feet carrying her over the worn pavement, past the line of vehicles waiting to be inspected. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a weak golden light over the scene, making the metal of the barriers glint sharply. Shadows stretched long across the ground. The morning was quiet except for the occasional sound of an engine, a guard's boots, or the rustle of a bag being searched. When she reached the main inspection area, her stomach tightened. Guards moved with sharp efficiency, handling each person as though they were parts of a machine. There was no room for hesitation, no tolerance for mistakes. She was aware of every movement, every sound, every glance that passed near her. The bag on her shoulder suddenly felt heavier, and she adjusted it instinctively, almost as if to remind herself that she was ready. Her mind replayed every instruction she had received before leaving. Keep calm, do not argue. Cooperate, but do not give unnecessary information. Look confident, even if you feel anything but. She repeated the words in her head like a mantra, a steady rhythm to keep her focused. She could feel a dry tension at the back of her throat, but she swallowed it down and kept moving. The guards called her forward, their voices sharp, commanding attention. She approached the table where the main inspection would take place. 2 guards stood there, one flipping through documents quickly, the other watching her every move. She placed her bag on the table as instructed and stepped back slightly, hands visible and relaxed. She had learned this over years of navigating similar situations. How to appear compliant yet confident, aware yet calm. The search began slowly at first, with the guards sifting through her belongings in a methodical, almost mechanical way. Papers were unfolded, items shifted, small packages examined. She watched silently, her chest tightening as each familiar object was scrutinized. Memories flashed briefly, moments of frustration from previous searches, moments of relief when nothing was found, the constant tension of being under watchful eyes. She could feel the impatience of the people behind her, the subtle sighs and shifting of weight, but she could not let that affect her. She reminded herself that their journey, their worry, was not hers to carry. She only had to focus on her task, to get through this checkpoint without incident. Time seemed to stretch. Each second felt longer than it was. The guards handled her items as though they were weighing not just their physical presence, but the meaning behind them. It was not just a search, it was a test of endurance, patience, and composure. She kept her face calm, her eyes steady, and her breathing measured. She did not flinch when an item was lifted or turned. She did not speak unless spoken to. Every small gesture was considered deliberate. A faint click of a radio broke the rhythm. She noticed one of the guards glance toward the source of the sound, nodding in acknowledgement before returning to his task. The brief distraction made her heart skip a beat. She wondered who was on the other end, what instructions were being given, and whether it might affect her journey. She reminded herself to stay focused. She could not control what others said or did. She could only control herself. Her mind wandered briefly to the purpose of her journey, to the people who depended on her. That thought brought a sense of resolve, strengthening her posture and calming the small tremble in her hands. She remembered the faces of those awaiting her arrival, the anticipation and the trust they had placed in her. It was not just her journey. It was theirs, too. The search continued, each item examined with careful scrutiny. She noticed the guard's eyes linger on a small notebook, flipping through pages filled with handwriting that mattered only to her. She felt a pang of vulnerability. These words were private, personal, yet here they were, under someone else's judgment. She reminded herself not to show any sign of discomfort. A slight frown or twitch could change the tone of the interaction. Hours, or what felt like hours, passed in a tense blur. She was aware of the rising sun, the growing warmth on her face, the distant sounds of the town waking up around the checkpoint. She felt every movement, every gesture magnified, as though the small space around her had become a stage where every action mattered. Finally, the guard closed the last small compartment of her bag. He looked at her with the same expressionless face, then scribbled something on his clipboard. He set the pen down and motioned for her to step aside. Relief washed over her in a small wave, but she did not let it show. She moved carefully, gathering her bag and adjusting the strap over her shoulder. She took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. The checkpoint was behind her for now, but she knew the journey was far from over. Every step she took carried the weight of the morning, the search, and the uncertainty still ahead. Yet within her was a quiet determination, a sense that she could continue, that she could face whatever came next. As she walked past the last guard, she caught a brief glance from someone in uniform, a small flicker of acknowledgement. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, yet it felt like a small reassurance, a reminder that not everything was rigid and unyielding. Some humanity remained, even in a place built on rules and caution. The morning air felt a little lighter now, the sounds of the town a little less distant. She adjusted her bag once more and set her gaze forward. She had made it through the first obstacle, but she knew that the real test might still be waiting. The memory of this moment, of every feeling, every glance, and every sound would stay with her. It would remind her of the patience, the courage, and the quiet strength that had carried her this far. Her journey had truly begun. She stopped at the next section of the checkpoint, the area where the main searches were conducted. The space was crowded with people, each carrying a mix of hope, fear, and resignation. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and metal. Guards moved with quick precision, their faces firm and unyielding. There was no warmth in their expressions, only the calm authority of those who were used to power in small doses, making ordinary people wait, worry, and comply. Her bag was placed on the metal table in front of two guards. The first guard, tall and lean, started by opening the top zipper and pulling out her small notebook. He flipped through the pages with deliberate care, She watched silently, keeping her face calm though inside her chest felt tight and her stomach churned. The notebook contained everything from directions to small personal notes, memories of her journey, and lists that mattered only to her. Each page was scrutinized, and she felt as though her privacy was being weighed against the strict rules of the checkpoint. The other guard, shorter and stockier, began to go through the main compartment. He pulled out a water bottle, a small medical kit, and a few packets of food. Each item was examined, touched, and sometimes set aside with a grunt. She could see the faint crease between his eyebrows as he studied the contents, turning some of them over in his hands. It was not just a search. It was a slow test of patience and endurance, designed to see how much a person could tolerate without breaking. She stayed calm, her hands resting lightly at her sides. Every now and then, she shifted her weight from one foot to the other to ease the tension in her legs. She forced herself to breathe steadily, counting silently in her head to keep from panicking. She had been through checkpoints before, but each one carried its own uncertainty, its own hidden rules. This one seemed especially tense. The guards' movements were precise, almost mechanical, yet there was a sense that they were looking for something more than physical objects. They were searching for hesitation, doubt, or fear. She reminded herself to stay composed. One wrong look, one tremor, one sigh could change everything. She had learned through experience that patience was as important as preparation. People around her shifted nervously, whispering to one another or fidgeting with their belongings. She noticed a young man behind her, glancing over her shoulder, his eyes wide with worry. He reminded her of herself moments ago, walking up to this very same space with a similar mix of fear and resolve. The tall guard paused and lifted her notebook slightly, examining the cover, then the pages inside. He frowned slightly, running a finger over some of the handwritten notes. She felt a small pang of vulnerability, a reminder that all these items were not just physical objects. They carried pieces of her life, her memories, and her plans. She swallowed hard but kept her face calm. There was no reason to show discomfort. The guard finally set the notebook aside and moved on to a small folder of papers. The search felt endless. Time seemed to stretch and contract, each second heavy with possibility. She could hear the faint hum of radios and the occasional barked command from other guards adding to the tension. A few travelers tried to speak up, asking questions or explaining their items, but they were met with curt responses and dismissive gestures. She knew that any attempt to argue would only worsen her situation. Patience and composure were her allies now. As the search continued, the guard handling her bag pulled out a small package of supplies. He turned it over in his hands, examining it carefully. She watched his face closely, noting the brief flicker of curiosity before he returned to his neutral expression. He seemed satisfied with what he saw, but she knew better than to assume the search was over. There was always one more moment, one more test, one more delay waiting just around the corner. Her mind drifted briefly to the purpose of her journey. She had to deliver these supplies to people who depended on her, families who counted on her for help, for hope, for relief in difficult times. She thought of the faces she had met, the stories she had heard, and the urgency that had driven her here. That thought strengthened her resolve. She could endure this moment, this discomfort, because what lay ahead mattered far more than the tension at the checkpoint. The shorter guard had now moved to a smaller pocket in her bag. He pulled out a few personal items, some toiletries, a small wallet, and a set of keys. Each item was examined briefly, then returned. She kept her posture steady, hands relaxed at her sides and eyes forward. She reminded herself that fear or impatience could be noticed even in the smallest way. Every micro-expression mattered, and she had to remain calm. A slight rustle came from behind her as other travelers shifted their positions. Some were growing impatient, others resigned, and a few whispered quietly to themselves or companions. She could feel the tension in the air like a tangible weight pressing on her shoulders. She focused on her breathing, the steady rise and fall of her chest as a small anchor in the storm of uncertainty around her. The guard's inspection was thorough. Every zipper opened, every compartment examined, every small object moved and inspected. She noticed how methodical they were, almost as if they were following an invisible checklist in their minds. Nothing escaped their attention. Yet their focus did not seem personal. It was procedural, impersonal. Yet it carried the power to disrupt her journey completely. She remained silent, speaking only when asked simple questions. "Where are you going?" "What is in the bag?" She answered each in a calm, clear voice. There was no defensiveness, no hesitation, only the truth, delivered with careful neutrality. She knew that any attempt to embellish or explain further could backfire, and so she kept her responses simple, concise, and factual. Time seemed to stretch longer with each passing moment. She could feel the weight of every second, each one a small test of her endurance. Her hands twitched slightly as the guard moved a small medical kit in the bag, checking each item with care. She reminded herself to remain calm, to steady her hands, to breathe. One deep breath after another, each a quiet reassurance that she could endure this, that she could remain composed no matter what happened. Her thoughts drifted again to the people waiting for her. She thought of the families, the children, the elderly, and the sick who depended on her. That thought became a source of quiet strength. She realized that while the guards held authority here, they could not touch her determination, her purpose, or the reason she had come this far. That purpose was hers alone, untouchable, and it gave her the courage to face every moment of uncertainty with calm resilience. The tall guard finally returned her notebook to the bag and closed the zipper carefully. He gave a small nod, then motioned for the shorter guard to finish the remaining items. She adjusted her stance slightly, shifting her weight to stay comfortable but remaining steady and composed. Her eyes scanned the area briefly, noting the movements of other travelers and guards, but she kept her focus largely inward, unsteadying herself and maintaining composure. The shorter guard pulled out the last few items, a small set of personal documents and a few miscellaneous supplies. He examined each item briefly, then returned them to her bag with meticulous care. She could feel a subtle shift in the energy around her as though the search was nearing its end. Yet she did not let herself relax fully. She knew better than to assume anything until she had physically passed beyond this checkpoint. Finally, the guards closed her bag completely. The sound of the zippers snapping shut felt almost ceremonial. She watched the guards carefully, noting their expressions, trying to gauge if the inspection was truly over. The tall guard scribbled something on a clipboard, then looked up at her with a neutral expression. There was no smile, no sign of relief, only the steady, calm authority that had dominated the space since she arrived. "Step aside," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. She nodded slightly and picked up her bag carefully, adjusting the strap over her shoulder. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she did not let it show outwardly. There was still caution in every step, every glance as she moved past the table where the search had taken place. Her heart still beat quickly, but the tension in her chest began to ease slightly. She had made it through this part of the checkpoint, survived the close scrutiny, and maintained her composure. She felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, not for herself alone, but for the journey she carried forward, for the people who depended on her, and for the purpose that had driven her here. As she walked away, she noticed small moments of humanity around her, the sympathetic glance of a guard, the brief nod of someone passing by, the quiet patience of other travelers enduring the same scrutiny. It reminded her that even in places of strict rules and tension, small acts of understanding and restraint existed. They did not change the rules, but they made the passage possible, even if only slightly easier. The morning sun now illuminated the checkpoint fully, casting long shadows across the ground and warming the metal barriers. She felt a renewed sense of determination. The journey was far from over, but she had already taken the hardest steps. The checkpoint had tested her patience, her composure, and her endurance, but she had emerged steady, focused, and ready to continue. She adjusted her bag one final time, her eyes scanning the path ahead. Every step she took now carried the weight of a. She stepped away from the table, her bag securely over her shoulder, but the tension in the air did not ease. Even though the guards had finished their thorough search, she felt as though she was still under a microscope. Each step she took was careful, measured, as though moving too quickly might draw unwanted attention. She could feel eyes on her from different directions, some sharp, some curious, and some indifferent. Every glance seemed to carry a question: who is she? Where is she going? What does she carry that matters? The sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the checkpoint. Metal barriers reflected the brightness, making the space feel even more exposed. She squinted against the glare, adjusting the strap of her bag again. A small ritual to keep herself grounded. Around her, other travelers moved slowly, many still waiting for their turn to be inspected. She could feel their unease, the small size, the restless shuffling of feet. She understood it all too well, having been in their place countless times before. Her mind wandered briefly, trying not to dwell on fear. She reminded herself that every step she took had a purpose. She carried important documents, supplies, and personal belongings, yes, but she also carried responsibility. People were depending on her. That thought gave her a quiet strength, a steady flame of determination in the midst of uncertainty. She tightened her grip on her bag, feeling the weight of her purpose more than the weight of the physical items inside. As she walked, she noticed a few guards standing a little distance away, their eyes trained on her. It was not unusual. They monitored everyone, but something in the way they watched made her pause. She could not read their intentions, yet the focus of their gaze made her acutely aware of every movement she made. She adjusted her stance, making sure her shoulders were straight, her head held high. Calm, confident, unflinching. These were her tools now. The sounds of the checkpoint surrounded her. Radios crackled intermittently, a low hum of activity that seemed both distant and immediate. Footsteps echoed on the concrete, and the occasional barked order cut sharply through the air. People whispered quietly to one another, speaking in hushed tones that carried worry, impatience, or frustration. The atmosphere was heavy, dense with emotion, but she moved as if she were separate from it, focused entirely on the path ahead. Despite her composure, her stomach tightened with each step. She had learned that checkpoints were unpredictable. Sometimes even after a search, something trivial could cause a delay. A missing document, a misread form, a misunderstanding. She reminded herself to stay alert, aware of every detail, but not to let fear control her. Calm observation was the key. Every second, every movement mattered. She approached a narrow lane where a few other travelers had gathered, waiting for the next step. Some were carrying large bags, some small, but all wore the same mixture of worry and resolve. She noticed a young woman glancing nervously at the guards, her hands fidgeting with a strap on her bag. She recognized the feeling all too well, the tension, the uncertainty, the hope that everything would go smoothly. She took a slow breath, grounding herself, reminding herself that patience and composure were her greatest allies. A faint crackle of a radio caught her attention. One of the guards glanced toward the source, nodding slightly before returning to his post. It was a small moment, but it reminded her of the unseen network controlling the flow of the checkpoint. Orders, instructions, and decisions were being communicated invisibly, yet they affected every person present. She could not see who was giving commands, but she knew they held power over her next steps. Her mind raced briefly with what-ifs, but she pushed them aside. She focused on the present, on what she could control, her posture, her breathing, her calm demeanor. Every small adjustment mattered. She noticed how the guard's eyes flicked over her occasionally, assessing her, measuring her, trying to determine if she was honest, if she was nervous, if she was hiding anything. She held their gaze briefly when caught, letting them see only calm and confidence. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Each moment was heavy with possibility, with tension, with the invisible weight of authority. She could feel it pressing down, but she also felt a quiet resolve growing inside her. This was not just a test of physical patience. It was a test of endurance, of focus, of inner strength. She had faced challenges before, but each checkpoint felt uniquely designed to make a person question themselves. Yet here she was, steady, unwavering, and aware. Her attention drifted to the small details around her. A guard adjusted his belt, the metal clinking softly. A vehicle honked faintly in the distance, impatient to move forward. Papers rustled as another traveler tried to organize their documents. Even the smallest sound seemed amplified in her awareness, each one a tiny pulse in the rhythm of the checkpoint. She tuned into it all without letting it disturb her calm. Awareness without panic. Observation without fear. As she continued forward, a subtle shift occurred. One of the guards, the tall one she had noticed earlier, stepped slightly aside, whispering into his radio. The crackle of the device carried faintly across the space. She caught a glimpse of the guard's expression. Brief surprise, a flicker of recognition, then a return to neutrality. Something was happening beyond her understanding, but she felt it. A small change in the energy of the checkpoint, subtle, yet significant. She kept moving, her eyes scanning the area, alert to everything. Her bag pressed lightly against her side, a constant reminder of the responsibility she carried. Each step was deliberate, careful, measured, but her mind was alive with speculation. Who was on the radio? What instructions were being given? Would they affect her? She could not answer any of these questions. So she focused on what she could do, move forward calmly, stay aware, and remain steady. A sudden noise, a raised voice from another traveler, made her pause for a moment. The man argued with a guard over a small item, his tone rising in frustration. She felt a flash of tension in her chest, recognizing the danger of conflict. One raised voice could escalate quickly, could attract attention, could put her at risk. She took a deep breath, letting the tension slide off her shoulders, reminding herself that patience and composure were far more powerful than confrontation. As she stepped closer to the end of the lane, another guard motioned her forward. She complied, keeping her expression neutral, but she could feel the tight knot of anticipation in her stomach. Something was about to happen, though she did not know what. She was acutely aware of every movement around her, every subtle signal, every tiny shift in the rhythm of the checkpoint. It was like walking through a space where every detail mattered, where every micro moment could change everything. She reached the small table at the end of the lane, where an officer was waiting. The officer looked at her bag, then back at her, his eyes sharp, assessing. He asked a few questions, his tone professional but firm. She answered calmly, carefully, without hesitation. The questions were simple, but the weight behind them was heavy. Each word mattered. Each pause could be scrutinized, each gesture interpreted. She kept her hands visible, her posture relaxed but steady and her gaze level. The officer lifted her bag slightly, examining it quickly, then set it down. She noticed the faint flicker of recognition in his eyes, though it was gone almost immediately. Someone had caught his attention. She could not know what it was, but she felt the shift in the energy around her. The moment was brief, almost imperceptible, yet it changed everything. A quiet sense of anticipation grew inside her, a sense that the moment she had been waiting for or dreading might be approaching. Her thoughts returned to the people she was helping. She pictured their faces, their hope, their reliance on her. That thought gave her a quiet calm, a steady strength. The tension around her was heavy, but it could not touch the purpose she carried inside. No amount of scrutiny, no amount of delay, no amount of uncertainty could diminish the reason she was here. That thought anchored her, grounding her in a calm determination that even the officer's watchful eyes could not shake. The faint crackle of a radio broke the moment again. One of the guards glanced toward the sound, then back at her. The energy in the air shifted slightly, a subtle change she could feel but not fully understand. She continued to stand calmly, holding herself steady, every nerve alert, every sense tuned to the smallest detail. The moment stretched, long and suspenseful, every second heavy with possibility. She could see the officer pick up the radio briefly, speaking in a low, clipped tone. The response came back almost immediately, though she could not hear the words. The officer nodded once, almost imperceptibly, then returned his attention to her. Something had changed, though she could not yet tell what. The anticipation built quietly, like a small spark in the darkness, a promise that the situation might shift in her favor or against her at any moment. She shifted slightly, adjusting her bag, reminding herself to breathe steadily, to keep calm. Every movement mattered. Every detail, every glance, every sound was part of the unspoken test she was undergoing. Yet beneath the tension, beneath the uncertainty, there was a quiet current of hope, a sense that perhaps something or someone might intervene, that this moment could change in ways she could not predict. The officer's eyes met hers briefly, then returned to her bag. He moved deliberate. She stood frozen for a moment, feeling the tension in the air reach its peak. The officer was looking at her bag again, his fingers hovering over the last compartment, and the radio crackled faintly in the background. The sound was low, almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. Something was happening beyond her view, beyond her understanding, yet she could sense it. Every instinct in her body told her that this was the moment that could change everything. The officer picked up the radio, speaking into it in a clipped, measured voice. She could not hear the words clearly, but she watched every movement, every subtle gesture. The guard's face, previously stern and neutral, shifted slightly, an almost imperceptible flicker of recognition and curiosity. Something had been communicated, and it was clear that it affected his next actions. She remained calm, steady, her hands lightly resting at her sides, her gaze level. Then, over the crackle of static, a voice spoke. It was clear, firm, yet calm, commanding attention. Let her through. The words were brief, but they carried authority, a decisive power that cut through the tension of the checkpoint like a knife. She felt her chest tighten, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over her. The voice had changed everything. The invisible weight pressing down on her seemed to lift slightly, replaced by a cautious hope she had not allowed herself to feel before. The officer's eyes widened briefly as he processed the command. He looked at his colleagues, who had been observing silently, then back at her bag. There was a moment of hesitation, a pause heavy with the unspoken question, should we follow these instructions? The crackle of radios continued faintly in the background, but the words lingered in the air, clear and undeniable. Let her through. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, her hands steady, trying not to show the sudden relief that threatened to escape. She had trained herself for moments like this, to maintain composure even when hope appeared suddenly. She could feel the tension around her start to shift. The officers, previously rigid and unyielding, now moved with a different energy. Their gestures were slower, more deliberate, yet there was a subtle compliance in their movements that had not been there before. The shorter guard, who had been quietly observing, gave a small nod to the taller officer. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it carried agreement. The command had come from above. Someone with authority. Someone who could make the impossible possible. She could feel it in the way the guards' posture relaxed slightly, the way their movements became more routine, less interrogative, less scrutinizing. As the officer began to return items to her bag, she noticed her pulse slowing slightly. The tight knot of fear in her stomach loosened just a little. Each item returned felt like a small victory, a confirmation that the command had been followed. Her bag, once an object of scrutiny and suspicion, was now a tool of passage, a symbol of the unseen authority that had intervened on her behalf. The moment stretched, yet it moved quickly at the same time. She watched carefully, noting every micro-expression, every gesture, every small sign that indicated the change in energy. The officers moved with precision, their eyes still observant, but there was no longer the same tension that had weighed down the space moments before. She felt a quiet awe at how a few simple words, spoken with authority, could shift the entire atmosphere of a place that had seemed impenetrable. She remembered the anticipation she had felt walking into the checkpoint, the fear, the nervousness, the uncertainty. And now, standing in the same spot, she felt a mixture of relief, curiosity, and gratitude. Relief that the barrier to her journey was being lifted. Curiosity about the unseen figure who had given the command, and gratitude for the intervention that had made all the difference. The officer gestured for her to move forward. She picked up her bag carefully, her hands steady, her movements deliberate. She kept her posture straight, her gaze calm, aware of every step, yet aware too that the tension had shifted. It was no longer oppressive. It was a space of cautious transition. She walked slowly, deliberately, observing the subtle changes around her. Other travelers watched silently, perhaps sensing that something significant had occurred, though they did not understand what. The crackle of radios continued faintly in the background, but the command to let her through remained, a steady anchor in the chaos of the checkpoint. She could feel the difference it made, the way the guards moved with less rigidity, the way the space seemed to breathe more freely. It was a reminder that sometimes, unseen forces and small acts of authority could change the course of events in ways that were both unexpected and profound. She walked past the final barrier, each step feeling lighter than the last. The metal of the gate gleamed in the morning sunlight, the shadows stretching long across the ground. She could hear the faint hum of traffic beyond the checkpoint, the normal rhythm of the town returning. The heavy weight of scrutiny, the oppressive tension had begun to fade. She could feel the shift not just in the environment around her but inside herself. Relief tempered with cautious awareness coursed through her veins. A guard called out behind her, confirming her passage, and she offered a slight nod in acknowledgement. She did not speak, keeping her focus forward, but inside she felt the stirrings of gratitude. Gratitude for the unseen voice, for the authority that had intervened, for the small yet decisive action that had changed the outcome. She wondered briefly who it could have been, what connection they had to her, and why they had made that choice. The questions remained unanswered, but they did not diminish the relief that filled her. As she moved further away from the checkpoint, the people around her began to return to their own routines. Some moved quickly, eager to leave the space, while others lingered, still caught in the tension of waiting. She noticed the small interactions around her, the quiet nods, the brief gestures, the subtle movements of acknowledgement. The checkpoint, once a space of intense scrutiny and uncertainty, had shifted into a place of cautious normalcy. She adjusted her bag once more, feeling the familiar weight on her shoulder. It was heavier than just the physical contents. It carried the responsibility of her journey, the importance of her mission, and now the memory of the intervention that had allowed her to pass. She took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs, feeling the tension ease gradually with each exhale. Calm, steady, composed. That was her anchor, her constant companion through every challenge. Her thoughts returned to the people waiting for her on the other side of the checkpoint. Families, children, and others depended on her. The documents, the supplies, the small items she carried, all of it mattered deeply. The relief she felt at being allowed through did not diminish the seriousness of her journey. It strengthened her resolve, reminding her why she had endured every moment of tension and scrutiny. The sun now shone fully on the checkpoint, bathing the metal barriers and the worn pavement in bright light. She could see the town beyond, alive with movement and sound, yet she remained focused on the path immediately ahead, one step at a time, each deliberate, each measured, carrying her closer to the purpose that had driven her here. She felt a quiet sense of triumph, not for herself alone, but for the people who depended on her, for the mission she carried forward, and for the unseen forces that had intervened on her behalf. As she walked, she reflected on the moment when the voice on the radio had spoken, "Let her through." The words were simple, yet they carried immense weight. A single act, a single decision had changed everything. She could not know the person who had spoken, nor could she understand fully why they had chosen to intervene, but she could feel the impact, a tangible difference in the energy of the checkpoint and in her own body. The fear that had weighed so heavily moments before had been replaced by cautious hope. She passed by other travelers, some moving quickly, others still caught in their own uncertainty. She felt a small pang of empathy, remembering how she had stood in their place, feeling the weight of scrutiny and tension. She understood that not everyone would be as fortunate, that not every journey would receive such intervention. It made her grateful, and it made her aware of the fragility of circumstance, the importance of timing, and the quiet power of unseen acts. The checkpoint slowly receded behind her, and she felt the tension finally start to fade. Her steps became lighter, her breathing steadier, her posture more relaxed. Yet she remained alert, aware that the journey was far from over. The space beyond the checkpoint was no less uncertain, no less filled with potential obstacles, but she felt the quiet strength that had carried her through each moment so far. She adjusted her bag one last time, feeling the comfort of readiness, the weight of purpose, and the reassurance of authority that had intervened. Every movement, every step, every breath carried her closer to the people she was helping, to the mission that mattered, and to the sense of accomplishment that came from facing fear and uncertainty with calm determination. The voice on the radio, though unseen, remained in her thoughts. It was a reminder that small acts of authority, small decisions, and small interventions could have profound consequences. It was a reminder that even in the most tense and controlled environments, there was room for humanity, judgment, and mercy. And it was a reminder that she was not alone, even in moment.